It's gonna be kind of confusing.
Oh, this is kind of confusing.
It's a little confusing.
Man, sounds confusing.
It's gonna be very confusing. Nothing too confusing.
Try not to confuse you guys.
This may seem confusing,
It's pretty confusing.
but it's actually really confusing. Kind of confusing, and it's a pretty confusing topic.
It can get kind of confusing. Kind of confusing. That'll get too confusing. Confusing. Oh, that's confusing. Confusing. So I know this is kind of confusing. It can get really confusing and make things real confusing.
Confusing.
Pretty confusing.
I'm sorry it wasn't more confusing.
It's just really confusing, but I mean, it's even confusing for me. This is pretty confusing.
One of the confusing parts.
Something that might be confusing.
Confusing me.
It's just too confusing.
So is not confusing.
It looks really confusing.
It's confusing, but
This test can be kind of confusing, but this is confusing. Other confusing thing. I know that this is very confusing. If any of this seems confusing, a little confusing, it'd be confusing. Way too confusing.
sounds confusing.
Sounds confusing.
Kind of confusing thing that
Kind of confusing. This is gonna be a little confusing.
It's not as confusing.
confusing thing.
Kind of confusing, but
Sounds confusing, but it can be confusing. Pretty confusing, but kind of confusing. That's kind of confusing way.
Might have been somewhat confusing, but I understand it can get confusing.
most confusing thing ever.
Kind of confusing.
Kind of confusing.
And I know this is kind of confusing.
It's kind of confusing. Do anything too confusing.
You can get really confusing.
Maybe kind of confusing.
Kind of confusing. Get confusing up, and it's probably confusing.
So confusing, but
They seem confusing or confusing.
Pretty confusing, huh?
No, it may be confusing. Confusing me. The most confusing kind of confusing. So I know that's kind of confusing. Kind of confusing.
I know it sounds confusing.
Probably confusing. It can get really confusing.
It's confusing.
So this is kind of confusing.
It is confusing.
Tutorial was confusing.
It can be confusing.
Make it really confusing. Pretty confusing.
Confusing. Really confusing. Pretty confusing.
Pretty confusing, huh?
Like confusing. If I made this confusing, then
Confusing. Got very confusing. Kind of confusing. It may sound confusing, but this is kind of confusing. It's most confusing.
confusing. Because this is really confusing.
This can be confusing.
It's not too confusing.
It seems kind of confusing.
And it sounds confusing.
It's confusing.
Probably confusing.
Kind of confusing. I know it was kind of confusing, and this tutorial kind of confusing. Confusing is kind of confusing.
Probably the most confusing thing.
It's confusing this one,
A
but
few more confusing things. It might seem confusing. I was just gonna confuse it. It's really confusing.
kind of confusing.
It's more confusing.
Very confusing. It's kind of confusing. It can get very confusing. It can get confusing.
Confusing.
Pretty confusing. Probably confusing because it's kind of confusing. It's gonna be kind of confusing. Just kind of confusing now.
Kind of confusing. Oh, confusing.
Too, I know it's confusing.
And it got kind of confusing.
Kind of confusing. Can get kind of confusing. Kind of confusing. That's gonna get confusing. It can be kind of confusing. I know that this is kind of confusing, and I know that this is kind of confusing.
Confusing
This may be confusing.
That's kind of confusing.
No, it's real confusing.
Now I know this is confusing.
and confusing you.
Was confusing it? It's kind of confusing. Is it kind of confusing?
Kind of confusing.
Really confusing.
You know, confusing. It looks confusing right now.
Can be kind of confusing.
It's gonna be confusing.
I know that's confusing. So I know it's confusing.
It's just too confusing. Or kind of confusing. So I know it's kind of confusing.
It seems confusing and confusing.
Or kind of confusing. Or something confusing.
Pretty confusing.
Is kind of confusing.
Like really confusing.
Confusing thing. Really confusing.
This may be confusing.
That sounds confusing. Not too confusing.
Be confusing right now. It can be kind of confusing. Kind of confusing. You're kind of confusing me. Confusing file would be.
And it wasn't too confusing. A little confusing.
It's kind of confusing. The most confusing.
Real confusing.
A little confusing.
Oh, this is kind of confusing.
Still kind of confusing.
More confusing. And confusing. Really confusing.
Kind of confusing. I know it's confusing right now. So it's kind of confusing. Kind of gets confusing.
Fox, it's gonna be confusing. Can get confusing.
Confusing.
Kind of confusing. So confusing. I know it's kind of confusing. Kind of confusing.
Confusing.
Confusing. Most confusing part.
Might sound confusing.
See, that might get confusing.
Confused, and I was actually
Kind of a confusing. Gets confusing.
confusing crap.
Kind of confusing.
All the confusing. It's very confusing.
And most confusing. I know it can get confusing. It's not really confusing. Very confusing. It's so confusing. Might be confusing.
Really confusing. It's kind of confusing.
It's really confusing.
The confusing methods.
Only confusing thing would
Found confusing and more confusing.
that sounds confusing.
Pretty confusing. Confusing for. This is getting confusing. This is kind of confusing.
Kind of confusing.
Sounds confusing. That was kind of confusing. It'll be way too confusing.
It looks really confusing.
It's kind of confusing.
The only confusing part sound confusing. Most confusing part.
Actually, pretty confusing.
This is too
Gonna
confusing.
get kind of confusing.
And now to this confusing thing.
Kind of confusing, but this is gonna be confusing.
It's kind of confusing.
Confusing.
Can be kind of confusing.
the most confusing.
I know it's confusing.
This may seem kind of confusing.
They're really confusing. Now this can be kind of confusing. Just to make things more confusing.
I know it's real confusing. Trust me, everything is gonna be very confusing.